Welcome to Cedar Lane United Methodist Church and to the International Sunday School lesson for Sunday, March the 17th, 2024. The lesson today is from 1 Peter chapter 3. The lesson materials say that the topic is about defending our faith. And a lot of the text focuses on remaining steadfast in the Christian faith in the face of opposition and persecution. And that's the topic we're going to be talking about. The setting of this epistle is described at the very beginning and the very end of Peter's letter. He says he's writing to the exiles scattered throughout the 5 Roman provinces in Asia Minor: Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Roman provinces were administrative regions in the Roman Empire outside Italy that were governed by appointed governors. The 5 provinces that Peter mentions were located in what is now the nation of Turkey. The letter was most likely targeted to Gentile Christians living in those provinces. He may have been talking to Jewish Christians as well, but the focus was probably on Gentile Christians. We know that Peter's letter was written during the latter years of his ministry because at the end of his letter, Peter tells us that he's writing the letter from Rome. Peter ended his ministry in Rome and he was martyred there. He calls Rome Babylon in his letter, but like the book of Revelation, the name Babylon, the way he used it there, was symbolic for Rome, which was the center of worldly power throughout the Mediterranean. Peter says that Silas, also called Silvanus, both by Peter and Paul, was with him in Rome. This Silas was probably the very same Silas who traveled with Paul in the book of Acts. Peter says that Silas helped him compose the letter. Silas would have been very familiar with the churches in Asia Minor, and he was probably familiar with the issues they were facing. In addition, he was probably better at writing in Greek than Peter was. At the end of chapter 5 of his letter, Peter says this: "With the help of Silas, whom I regard as a faithful brother, I've written to you briefly, encouraging you and testifying that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it. She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings, as does my son Mark. Greet one another with a kiss of love. Peace to all of you who are in Christ." That's 1 Peter 5, verses 13 through 14. That's right at the end of his letter. Notice that Peter says here at the end of his letter that Mark was with him. This is probably the same Mark who wrote the gospel. The majority of Bible scholars think that Mark's gospel, the shortest of the 4 accounts, was the first gospel written down. And although Mark is never directly mentioned as an eyewitness to those events, he evidently did have a very close relationship with Peter, which led many early church leaders to believe that Peter was the source for much of the information in Mark's gospel. In the passage from 1 Peter chapter 5 quoted above, Peter calls Mark his son, but he may have been talking about this in a spiritual sense rather than a physical sense. One of the reasons I say that is because in Acts chapter 12, when Peter is released from prison, he went to the house of someone named Mary, who was the mother of someone named John, who was also called Mark. It's a kind of funny story. Peter knocked on the door. Everybody had known he was in prison and they were praying for him. And Peter was met at the house by a servant named Rhoda. When Rhoda heard Peter's voice, she got excited and went to tell everybody that Peter was free from prison, leaving Peter at the door outside the house, continuing to knock. The person named John Mark in that passage traveled with Paul and Barnabas in Acts. See Acts chapter 12, verse 25. And Paul says that he was the cousin of Barnabas. He says that in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. Paul also mentioned that Mark was with him in his letter to Philemon, which indicates that he was probably with Paul in Rome. See Philemon 1, verses 23 and 24. Scholars think that Paul wrote the letter of Philemon, and Danny talked about this earlier, along with Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, while he was imprisoned in Rome. Both Silas and Mark helped Peter as well as Paul. We know that Peter and Paul met with each other in Jerusalem and in Antioch, and toward the end of their ministries, tradition says they both ended up in Rome. Early church historians, very early church historians, said that they thought that both of them were martyred during persecutions instigated by the Emperor Nero. And this kind of gets to one of the things that is coming out in this letter to me. It appears that the apostles and the other leaders in the church worked hard to coordinate with each other as a team, helping each other and reinforcing each other's message. A lot of the people who helped Peter helped Paul, and vice versa. And Peter and Paul communicated with each other. For example, in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter mentions Paul and refers to Paul's letters as scripture. Peter says, bear in mind that our Lord's patience means salvation, just as our dear brother Paul also wrote to you with the wisdom that God gave him. He writes in the same way in all his letters, speaking in them of these matters. His letters contain some things that are hard to understand, and I can identify with that, which ignorant and unstable people distort as they do the other scriptures to their destruction. So Peter was endorsing what Paul was writing, calling it scripture. The people who, and the thing is, they were not only communicating with each other and helping each other, they were all reading the Old Testament. And that put them on the same page. The people who used to write the New Testament were not individualists sharing their own idiosyncratic ideas about the gospel. I couldn't think of another word for idiosyncratic, and it's hard to pronounce. But, their own individual points of view. They weren't trying to communicate what they thought. They followed the teachings of Jesus. And they compared what they were saying with each other. In Acts chapter 15, the Bible tells us that Paul met with Peter and the other apostles and elders in Jerusalem to make sure that he was conveying the truth of the gospel accurately. To all the people who gathered at that first council in Acts chapter 15, the gospel's core message was not a matter of opinion. There was truth and there was falsehood. And they all wanted to be on the side of the truth. New Testament writers, and this is part of what I'm bringing out in this whole lesson, New Testament writers were also guided by Old Testament scriptures. And today's lesson from 1 Peter chapter 3 is a good example of how the Old Testament helped shape the New Testament. Today's scripture passage has a fairly long quote from Psalms 34. And the passage from Psalms refers to a story about David in 1 Kings chapter 21. We can get a better understanding of what Peter is saying if we keep those Old Testament verses in our mind. And that's what I want to talk about in the rest of this lesson. Today's lesson starts in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through 10, where the Bible says, finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. In other words, work to all be together of one mind and on the same page. And that requires a certain kind of attitude where he says, do not repay evil for evil or insult for insult. To the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because you were called so that you may inherit a blessing. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. Peter was asking believers in Asia Minor to love each other and to remain like-minded. But beyond that, he was asking them to repay evil with blessing. Then, and this is part of what I'm focusing this lesson on, then he backs up what he's saying with a quote from Psalm chapter 34, where the Bible says this: whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, quoting Psalm 34, verses 12 through 16. I suspect that Peter may have meditated on Psalm 34 before he wrote his letter. He alludes to Psalm 34 in chapter 2 of his epistle when he says, like newborn babies, crave the pure spiritual milk so that by it you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. First Peter chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. This is a reference to verse 8 of Psalm 34, where David says, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. Psalm 34, verse 8. It makes sense that Psalm 34 may have influenced Peter's thinking about his letter. Peter was writing to churches in Asia Minor that were undergoing persecution for the sake of the gospel. At the beginning of his letter, he says that the believers who he addressed were exiles or aliens in the areas where they were living. In other words, they didn't fit in with the rest of society. They were suffering for their faith, enduring persecution and hardship, even though they hadn't done anything wrong. Peter used Psalm 34 to talk to these believers because the psalm is all about innocent people suffering for doing the right thing. The heading for the psalm says, of David, when he pretended to be insane before Abimelech, who drove him away and he left. This is a reference to 1 Samuel chapter 21. At that time, that passage in 1 Samuel, King Saul was pursuing David and trying to kill him, even though David had remained loyal to Saul and his son Jonathan the whole time they were together. King Saul knew that King Saul knew that God had rejected him, and he could see that David would eventually replace him. Saul was jealous of David. And he told his son Jonathan, he said to Jonathan, as long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, and the son of Jesse, he meant David, neither you, meaning Jonathan, nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him to me. In other words, bring David to Saul, for he must die. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 31. Jonathan warned David, and David fled with his men to a town called Nob outside Jerusalem, where apparently the tabernacle was located. During the time of the judges, the tabernacle had been located in Shiloh, which is north of Jerusalem, in Ephraim. But at this point, the tabernacle was apparently in Nob, outside near Jerusalem in Benjamin. A priest of Nob helped David by giving his men sanctified bread to eat. David had deceived the priest about the situation, but Saul didn't care that the priest had not intended to be disloyal. Saul had one of his men massacre the whole town of Nob in retaliation for what that priest did helping David. They killed men, women, children, and even the animals. 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 18 to 19. This is a story in the Old Testament that Jesus was familiar with. We know that because in Matthew chapter 12, when Jesus' disciples, including Peter, had harvested grain on the Sabbath in order to eat some of it, the Pharisees criticized them for breaking the law. Jesus responded by saying, "Haven't you read that what David did when he and his companions were hungry? They entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests." Matthew chapter 12, verses 3 and 4. Then Jesus says, "If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy and not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent." Matthew chapter 12, verses 7 and 8. So we know that both Jesus and Peter were familiar with the story in 1 Samuel. And it was likely that Peter also knew how Psalm 34 connected to that story. I could not determine exactly when the headings to the Psalms are inserted. It's the heading of Psalm 34 that connects it to the story in 1 Samuel. But from what I can tell, it was probably in the Bible a good bit before Peter's time. Getting back to 1 Samuel, when David left Nob, he fled to King Achish in the Philistine city of Gath, seeking protection from Saul. Saul was chasing him, trying to kill him. David had to go somewhere, so he ran to a Philistine city of Gath. Well, he had jumped from the frying pan into the fire because when he appeared before King Achish, the king's servant reminded him about a song that the people of Israel were singing about David. And the lyrics of the song went like this: "Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Well, the 10,000s that David had slain were Philistines, the very people he had gone to for help. Of course, David realized pretty quick that he may have made not the best decision. It was a risky decision at best. The Bible says that David became very much afraid of the king, and he acted like a madman. It says that spit was going down his beard, kind of vivid imagery. Well, God delivered David from danger. The king didn't want to be around a madman, so he sent him away, and David went out and hid in a cave. But the key point of this story about David and how it connects to what Peter's saying is this: the story about David continues all the way, and Saul continues all the way to King Saul takes his own life at the end of 1 Samuel. And during that whole time, David treated Saul honorably, despite the fact that Saul was trying to kill him. Twice in 1 Samuel, David had a chance to kill Saul, but he refused to do so because Saul was the Lord's anointed. See 1 Samuel chapter 24 and 1 Samuel chapter 26. David respected the anointed rulers. He respected the government, even though the government under King Saul was persecuting him. Well, how does that tie to Peter? Well, Peter was addressing people in Asia Minor, and he was telling them to respect their government in a similar fashion, even though the government was persecuting them. Peter says this, submit yourselves to the Lord's sake, and this is in 1 Peter chapter 2. Submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to be the emperor, and remember it was the emperor that killed Peter, as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect for everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God and honor the emperor. You know, that took a lot for him to say. He was in Rome. The persecution was already heating up. And it wouldn't be long before the emperor would have him killed. So here's part of what's going on here. Psalm 34, which was about this story I just told you from 1 Samuel. Psalm 34 is designed to speak to people who are suffering unjustly. It calls on afflicted people to trust God and to remain steadfast in doing good. Even when things go wrong, they need to trust in God's justice, mercy, and goodness. At the end of Psalm 34, David says this, the righteous cry out and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and he saves those who are crushed in spirit. The righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all. He protects all his bones, and not one of them will be broken. Evil will slay the wicked. The foes of the righteous will be condemned. The Lord will rescue his servants. No one who takes refuge in him will be condemned. Psalm 34, verses 17 through 22. Peter, in his letter, is trying to communicate a similar message to the believers of his day. In chapter 4 of his letter, Peter sums up how believers undergoing unjust persecution are supposed to respond. He says, dear friends, do not be surprised by the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you as though something strange was happening to you. But rejoice insomuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you're insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed. For the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. If you suffer, it should be not as a murderer or a thief or any other kind of criminal, or even as a meddler. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 16. Then a few verses later, Paul gets to the core idea he's trying to communicate, the one that ties to these other stories. He says to the believers in Asia Minor, so then, those who suffer according to God's will should commit themselves to their faithful Creator and continue to do good. 1 Peter 4:19. That's the same thing that David did when he was persecuted by King Saul. God delivered David from unjust persecution. And David celebrated that deliverance by writing Psalm 34. When Peter wanted to encourage believers enduring unjust persecution in Asia Minor, he used Psalm 34 to help get that message across. Peter used the scriptures that he quoted directly. But more than that, he also used those scriptures to reference Old Testament narratives that reinforced what he was saying. The same is true for Paul. They were writing to Gentile Christians, but they assumed that those believers had a strong understanding of the Old Testament. Their assumption about Gentile believers of their day also applies to us. When we read the New Testament, it is assumed that we know the Old Testament scriptures and the biblical narratives those scriptures are referencing. One of the things that I've become keenly aware of as I read through the Old Testament, and I hate to say that I've gone 50 years before I started this, but it's really making a difference. One of the things I've become clearly aware of is how much New Testament writers relied on the scriptures when they proclaimed the gospel to new Gentile Christians. The Gentile believers would not have started out with a strong background in the Old Testament. They were Gentiles. But when the writers of the New Testament wrote the Gospels and the epistles, they evidently assumed that those Gentile believers had studied and learned what the Old Testament scriptures were saying. Unless the New Testament writers assumed that the Gentiles they were addressing both knew and believed the Old Testament, then quoting the Old Testament scriptures as much as they did to back up what they were saying would not have made any sense. They had to believe that those Gentile Christians knew the Old Testament. So here's the bottom line and the conclusion. When Jesus rose from the dead, he told his disciples that the whole Old Testament pointed to him. Then he told his disciples that they were witnesses of that truth. And to back that up, see Luke chapter 24, verses 44 through 49. Later, when Jesus gave his disciples the Great Commission, he told them to make new disciples by baptizing those new disciples and teaching them all of his commandments. See Matthew 28, verses 16 through 20. Well, if we do it the way the apostles did it, if we do the way Peter did it and Paul did it, we need a strong background in the Old Testament. It follows that reading the Bible regularly is a necessary step to fulfilling the Great Commission. And that's part of what I think Peter is teaching us through this lesson. And that's what the point I tried to get across.